You're listening to Ghostumentary Scary Short Stories, original pieces updated throughout the week.
The Last Prisoner. Carl Thomas jolted awake to the sound of nothing. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, stretching out from every corner of his small cell, invading the space like a heavy fog. He blinked, groggy and disoriented, trying to remember if there'd been a commotion in the night. There was always noise, always the harsh sounds of prison life. Guards banged doors, inmates yelled. There were always the far-off clangs of boots on metal catwalks. But now, there was only silence, like everything he knew had been smothered in some invisible shroud. He glanced through the small slit in his cell door, looking for any sign of life. No guards, no rolling breakfast cart, no lights even. Only the dim, red emergency glow casting strange shadows along the floor. As the hours dragged by, Carl called out, his voice echoing back to him in a hollow tone that only deepened the solitude. He yelled, pounded on the steel door, until his throat was raw and his knuckles bled. He wasn't sure how long it had been. Was it morning? Afternoon? His stomach growled with a low ache, but there was no food, no one answering. He didn't sleep that night. He lay on the thin cot, eyes wide open, feeling the air around him close in heavy and thick. Day 2. He woke in a daze, head throbbing, mouth dry. The little sink in the corner dripped out a faint stream of rusty water, just enough to dampen his lips and ease the burning dryness in his throat. But the hunger, that was a new kind of pain. His stomach clawed and twisted, gnawing at itself. The hours stretched on, each second a torment. He counted every crack in the walls, every sound his cell made. The silence was maddening. Carl shouted, more out of desperation than anger, hoping, praying that someone would hear him. When the echoes of his own voice faded, all that was left was the oppressive stillness. Days 3 through 5. The hunger was a constant, relentless ache now, throbbing and stabbing with every shallow breath. He found himself tearing apart his pillow, biting into the foam inside, but it did nothing, just left his mouth full of dust and grit. His thoughts began to spiral. Images and memories flashed in his mind in odd, distorted ways. Sometimes he would hear voices, murmurs, laughs, whispers he could swear were just outside his cell door. He pounded his fists against the steel, desperate for even a glimpse of another human face, but there was no one. At night he lay curled up, shivering. The thin blanket felt like paper against his skin, and the cold seeped through the concrete walls. Sleep came in bursts, and his dreams were twisted, filled with visions of endless corridors, of food just out of reach, of doors that opened only to lead to more walls. He would wake, gasping, drenched in cold sweat, his heart pounding in his ears. Day 6. The clang rang through his cell like the snap of a whip, jolting Carl from his delirium. The cell door was open. He scrambled to his feet, nearly tripping over himself as he stumbled out into the empty corridor, calling out as he moved. His legs felt weak, like they could barely hold his weight, but he pushed on. The hunger in his belly was unbearable now, a fiery hole inside him that seemed to consume every thought. He stumbled into the chow hall, eyes darting to the abandoned trays, the stale bread, the cans of beans, even the scraps on the floor. He devoured it all, swallowing greedily, his shaking hands cramming every last bit into his mouth. But as his stomach filled, his hope faded, for there was no one here either, no guards, no inmates, no signs of life. 1 month later. Carl wandered the halls in a daze, searching for anything, anyone. He grew thin and hollow, his skin taut over his bones, his face sunken. He spent hours talking to himself, muttering, trying to remember the sound of his own voice. He tore apart every room, every cabinet, but each discovery was just a cruel reminder that there was no escape. The locks held fast, the gates wouldn't budge. The days blurred together, a single long moment of endless despair. He tried to ration the food in the pantry, but his desperation would always take over, his hunger forcing him to eat more than he should. Each day left him with less. At night, the whispers began again, low, distorted voices he could almost recognize but never quite place. They followed him through the halls, laughing, taunting him. Month 3. His mind was fraying now, bits of himself falling away like ashes in the wind. His reflection in the kitchen's broken mirror showed a gaunt, wild-eyed spectre, skin pale and bruised. His mouth was dry, cracked, his lips bleeding as he whispered to the empty air, carrying on conversations with shadows. One night he lay on the cold floor of the chow hall, staring up at the ceiling, no longer sure where he was or how he'd gotten here. He felt himself unraveling, pieces of himself slipping away. He tried to hold on to remember who he was, but his memories were faint, brittle things, fading into the silence. 6 months later, Carl Thomas lay on his cot, his body gaunt and broken, barely more than a skeleton covered in pale, sallow skin. His eyes were glazed, empty, and every shallow breath rattled in his chest. He had long stopped talking, long stopped shouting. His voice was gone, lost in the endless quiet. He felt himself drifting, slipping away, barely able to feel the cold anymore. His eyes closed and the world went dark. When Carl's eyes opened again, he was lying in a bed, but not the cot in his cell. The light overhead was bright, and he blinked, squinting as the shapes of people came into focus. A guard, 2 doctors, and a man in a suit, the warden. They looked down at him, their faces unreadable. "Mr. Thomas," one of the doctors said, looking at his watch with clinical detachment, "you've been under for 3 minutes and 45 seconds. Carl's heart thundered as the realization swept over him. 3 minutes? But it had been 6 months. He'd lived every second of it, felt every moment of hunger, pain, despair. His voice was weak, cracking as he tried to speak. It felt like," he stammered, his voice trembling. 6 months, the warden said, his eyes cold. "The system works precisely as intended." Carl's eyes widened as it all came crashing down. He was never in that prison alone. This had all been a simulation, a calculated form of execution. They were testing a new device, something that would stretch time inside a person's mind, forcing them to endure months, even years, within the span of minutes. "It's a new model for death row," the warden continued. "You were our first subject, Carl. Instead of a quick death, we give the condemned time to reflect, to suffer." He leaned closer, his voice a hiss. "A more fitting punishment." Carl tried to scream, but his voice was gone, lost in the silence that echoed back to him from the darkest corners of his mind. And as the device activated once more, he slipped back into the endless void, ready to begin another lifetime of suffering that would pass in mere minutes. Carl woke up in a jail cell alone. No idea what was ahead.
Looking for more scary tales? Subscribe to our podcast and visit ghostumentary.com. Let us know what you think or share with us your scary tales. We might just make a new story from it.